Part of that is the short history of the origin. Now, the origin is the absolute. It is everything. It is the all. There is nothing else. It is sentient energy, frequency, and dimension. Self-aware, sentient energy, and frequency, and dimension. And it has a level of structure. Within it, it has 12 zones, 12 full dimensions that are constructed of 3 tritaves or dimensional components, and 12 frequencies to each full dimension. And that would give you something like 5,183 different permutations of space if you were going to work it out. Now, as pure isness or energy, the origin, when it became self-aware, started to investigate itself. It dipped into some of the zones and some of the dimensions and some of the frequencies. But it noticed that when it did this, specifically when it went down the lower frequencies, it started to learn and experience. And it's the learning and the experience that led to evolution. And the origin thought, well, this is good. I like this evolution bit. I want some more. So it derived a strategy. And that strategy was to create 12 more versions of itself, separate to itself, external to itself, all given the same opportunity and criteria and energy sets that it had when it became aware. Now, for one reason or another, I can't go into it in any depth here, that failed. Can't understand why, and I've not interrogated the origin to understand why either. But that led to the origin retracing its steps and creating a new strategy. In this instance, it gave up around about half of itself and created 12 source entities, which were all created in equality, were all created inside the environment that was the origin, and were all lesser to itself, so that they all knew that they were part of something else. And as they became self-aware, the origin would contact them and tell them what their reason for existence was. So our source entity was created by the origin. And it's a singular energy source left to its own devices. And once it was self-aware, it was contacted by the origin and given a task. And that task was to experience and evolve in any way possible. It was up to it. It didn't matter how it did it. It experienced and it evolved. And it would pass that evolution content naturally onto the origin. So as the source entity evolved, the origin would evolve. Now, in part of its response to this, it decided to create a multiverse, loosely based upon the structure of the origin. And it populated it with entities. Half of itself was given up to environment and entities. And each of those entities, although they have different levels because of the amount of intention that the source entity gave to it when he created these entities, are individualized units of source entity. So when you consider that us in our energetic state, and the little bit of us that's projected into the physical, are parts of the source entity. We are all parts of God. We're all part of the source entity. So, and our role, I'll come to in a moment. But first, I want to go over the spiritual physics of the source entity's multiverse. The source entity's multiverse is based upon the origin's multiverse, but it doesn't have the 12 zones. It has 12 dimensions, 12 frequencies, and 12 tritaves. And each dimension, frequency, and tritave component creates an individual permutation of space, a universe as far as we're concerned. And if you want to try and consider how this works, the source entity gave me a concept to think about, and it said, well, consider the barrels on a combination padlock. And that each of those barrels has a number on it. And when you're trying to open a combination padlock, every time you turn the barrel once, the number changes. You have a different permutation of code. And that's a good way of thinking about how many different permutations of space we've got, because there are 12 times 12 times 3, which if you've got quick maths is 432, except it's not, it's 430. And the reason why it's 430 different universes in our multiverse is because the base dimension, the first dimension, which is inflated by 12 frequencies, and each frequency, by the way, contains all of the frequencies that we have ever measured, for instance, in the physical universe, or will ever measure in the physical universe. And that full dimension is created by the three basic dimensional components of a tritave. Those first ones in that first dimension equals 1. So there has to be a base dimension. And guess where we are? Dimension 1, frequency 1. So we're about as low as we can get. Okay? That's comforting, isn't it, really? The only way is up, gentlemen and ladies. The only way is up. Okay? So there's a lot out there. And the source entity then described to me how those dimensions work. And the full dimensions, so we'll ignore the tritaves right now, are grouped. And they're grouped in threes. So the first three dimensions are grouped in 3, 1, 2, and 3. Second group is grouped in 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so on and so on. But those dimensions, those full dimensions in those groups are linked together. And they're linked together to allow entities of the right evolutionary content to move freely around those dimensions and those frequencies. Now, I previously talked about the aliens using technology to do it, and that's quite okay. You can force the issue by using the right level of energetic technology to move through frequencies and dimensions. But what I'm talking about here is an entity's ability to do it of its own volition, based upon pure evolutionary level and intention. And if you've got a chance to read that, basically the source entity gave me an example of how a seventh dimensional entity can move around a couple of dimensions within its own linked group and move backwards and forwards. But a seventh dimensional entity can't move to the ninth dimension unless it's got the right level of evolutionary content. Of course, you can force the issue with engineering, but you know, if it wants to go on its own, of its own evolutionary content, it needs to evolve. If it wants to go down to the next group down, which is the sixth, fifth, and fourth level, okay, the second group of 3, it needs to create an energetic construct to help it do that, specifically because of how it might lose its own faculties. And similarly, an entity that's, say, at the top of that first group, the ninth dimension, can only go to the 10th dimension, which is the next group upwards, as a function of evolution. Okay, so if we've got all of these different dimensions existing concurrently, how the hell does that work? How can we understand that? We can't even work out how time works, let alone understanding how different dimensions go in there. So the source entity gave me a number of concepts, which I've previously explained are intuitively understood by myself, but inherently unexplainable in English language. So it said to me, well, let's think about things that mankind does that proves that things can happen at the same time. And for those of you who are engineers out there, please excuse some of the possible mistakes. Those of you who aren't, I'll try and make it simple. This is an example of how frequency modulation, FM radio, signals can be transmitted. And you have a single carrier wave and then a piece of information transmitted on it. And it said that if you consider this single carrier wave as being space and this sinusoid here as being a dimension, you could see that if you use the example of phase angle to multiplex radio data being transmitted all at the same time, then you might be able to space them individually and everything exists at the same time. So when we transmit radio waves, we sometimes transmit radio waves with multiplexed information, which means that we transmit a lot of different radio stations concurrently on the same carrier wave. And we do this quite a lot. Now, if we look at it from sorry, I'll move back. If we look at it from this side here, we'll have a sort of a bullseye effect. And the source entity said, if you consider that the center part here is your carrier wave, and that this part of angle here would be the difference in the different dimensions, you can see that each dimension can be in the same space concurrently by using the same area. So that was the source entity's way of explaining to me how the different dimensions can exist concurrently in the same space by using something that we as mankind use every day. We use multiplexing every day. A lot of your brand new cars, by the way, use a similar technology. And this is an excellent image that the source led me to show you how all these different examples of dimension can exist concurrently. And there's about 12 there. But it said, make a note, these areas here are where the links are, as a good example. These are where you can traverse the dimensions. Okay. So I want to summarize before I move on, because I want to move on to how we can ascend the frequencies, because we talk about ascension a lot, and that's frequency-based as against dimensional-based. So the origin is the absolute, and it created 12 source entities to assist in its evolution. And the creator of our multiverse, source entity 1, because there's 12, although I only mention it as just the source entity in the book, created a multiverse, and he populated it with ourselves. And that multiverse has 12 dimensions. The first 3 dimensional components of the first dimension create the physical universe. And if you think of it in our language, those first 3 dimensional components would probably equal height, width, and length. Okay? The higher dimensions are energetic. Although they may appear physical to the individual entities that are in there, they're energetic. Now, the dimensions are inflated with frequency bands to inflate them and allow progression. And those full dimensions are grouped in 3s and linked. And it's the linking that enables an entity to move around and experience the various different things they can in different permutations of the universe.